what we wanted to do for this part of the symposium was bring you people who are working on the ground on this issue as organizers, as leaders, as mediators, doing incredibly hard work, and in many of these countries, life-threatening work. And so we will be focusing on the issues of racism, conservation, Indigenous peoples' rights in two separate sessions. Our first will be on Africa, and our second will be in Asia. For Africa, we are very pleased to have as our panel moderator, Elifuraha Laltaika. Eli is another distinguished graduate of the Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy Program, having earned his SJD there. He was also our regional campaign manager for Africa on the IPLP initiative on Indigenous peoples affected by protected areas and other conservation measures. He is a former member of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and within the UN, and he is senior law lecturer in the Faculty of Law at Tumaini University, Makumira in Arusha. I will let Eli introduce himself and the other members of his panel that will be addressing us on the situation in Africa. Eli, are you there?
Yes, Professor Williams, I'm here. And thank you for the kind introduction.
It's yours. Go for it.
So, dear colleagues and friends, I cannot put the video, but I think I will go right away and introduce my panelists. And then I'll speak right away. And I have two amazing panelists. Leslie, like myself, is a graduate of the IPLP program. And we also have Kipto, who is an SJD candidate, is doing his PhD now in Arizona at the IPLP, and is from Kenya. So we are going to hear, as Professor Williams has said, quite some, experiences on the ground. So allow me to share my screen and start talking right away. My presentation, this is a privilege of being a moderator and a speaker. So Leslie and Kipto, you are in trouble because I'm going to use all the time. Please confirm if you can see my slides. Anyone? What?
Yes, Eli, we can see it.
Great. All right. So I'm going to talk about human dignity, conservation, and Indigenous peoples' rights in Africa, of course, as part of the reflection for the very important day internationally, the International Day of Forest and the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. And because Professor Williams made some groundwork providing the ABCs of what racial discrimination is, a very complex topic, but I had the privilege of being his student for 3 years. I think then you probably may be able to see the connections when we talk about racism, we talk about human dignity, and we talk about unfair targeting of Indigenous peoples in conservation. The work by Foucault and by Albert Memmi, I think that is enough, so I'll skip that part. But by way of introduction, I framed my presentation to include the following parts. One, we'll see the introduction of human dignity, why it matters in the context of racial discrimination, in the context of the right to equality, and then we'll see why it matters to talk about it in the context of conservation. I mean, as part of reflections for the International Day of Forest and the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. But my main interest will be in two UN Special Rapporteurs reports, one by Vicky and the other is by José, the current office bearer. Particularly, I'll be interested in José Francisco's recommendation for the strict adherence to the human rights-based approaches in the establishment and extension of existing protected areas. And I will provide, of course, a summary of a survey I did of protected areas legislation and framework environmental laws in Africa. And with the help of students of the IPLP clinic, and for this I thank Melanie, I did a survey of these laws and see how they embed on, they don't embed human rights values. And I had a particular emphasis on human dignity because it's all-embracing. And towards the conclusion, I'll make some recommendations on how José Francisco's report or recommendations for that matter can be implemented on the ground in Africa. And just not to preempt that part, but my finding, having conducted a survey of legislation relating to protected areas in Africa, is that the DNA of all the problems is in the laws. They are a relic of the colonial past for those countries, and therefore nothing can be done unless those laws are enacted, are repealed, or to decolonize, because the spirit is so much modeled along the spirit of Yosemite and national parks or fortress conservation. Now, human dignity, it is enshrined in the United Nations Charter. The UN Charter, talks about it, and that assures us that it is the foundation to modern international law. So the UN Charter says, human dignity or the dignity of the person is indispensable in saving succeeding generations the scourge of war, which has brought untold sorrow to humankind. So I like the way the UN Charter really premises avoidance of war and suffering to protection of human dignity. But apart from that, there's a very important document, I think the most important normative document called the UN Declaration on Human Rights. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it is different from the UN Declaration on Indigenous Peoples' Rights. And it also recognizes dignity as a foundation for freedom, justice, and peace. So just like the UN Charter, the UN Declaration says really unless we have human dignity respected, there can be no freedom, no justice, and there's no peace. But apart from these really global normative documents that are of high importance, we also see dignity enshrined in constitutions of almost all countries, with written constitutions, of course. And they have been subjects of pronouncements by all key Supreme Courts in all legal traditions. Talk of the common law tradition, the civil law traditions. All Supreme Courts have, in one way or the other, pronounced human dignity and how important it is. And for my purpose here, I take human dignity as really the foundation of all human rights, because, you know, it encompasses, you know, the right to equality, the right to non-discrimination, and as we will see, based on the reports presented to the UN General Assembly, indigenous people's rights happen at the beehive of that level of discrimination. Just as Professor Williams said when he talked about the 4 levels, you know, it's the violence that is meted or is advanced based on the differences that are observable in the subject. But in my own constitution of my home country, Article 9 talks about human dignity as well, and says it is indispensable, and it calls upon government officials to make sure that they respect human dignity in how they dispense business of the day. But why is it really important to talk about human dignity in the context of conservation and in the context of indigenous peoples in Africa? Of course, it's timely because we are celebrating the International Day of Forest, as I said, and the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination. But these reasons, 3 reasons, are really because, number one, it's a timeless advice by the Greek philosopher that an examined life is not worth living. I think this was Socrates, and I think it rings true up to now. That's the first reason. But the second reason is that conservation practices, and this will be clearer as we go through some reports of the UN Special Rapporteur, is that there's overwhelming evidence that when it comes to conservation, lives of indigenous peoples are not valued the same way as mainstream communities. Colleagues will attest to this, but you know, on the ground in many African parts, it is very difficult to demolish, for example, a kiosk of a small businessman in a city. It's more difficult than demolishing or reducing to ashes an entire village occupied maybe by hunter-gatherers or pastoralists to give way for you know, any other land use, such as trophy hunting or conservation and so on and so forth. Therefore, there's a body of evidence, scholarly and policy, showing that there is a mismatch. You know, there's a reason to doubt that there's no reason to doubt that lives of indigenous peoples are really not valued the same way in the context of conservation. But another reason is that, you know, this a renewed or revitalized global concern about, you know, the link between rights of indigenous peoples and conservation. And this follows from reports that have been submitted. José Francisco Calí, you know, presented also to the UN General Assembly, you know, a report showing how indigenous peoples all over the world are really suffering disproportionately when it comes to conservation. And what that does, it casts doubts on the perceived universality of human dignity. Someone is, you know, is justified if you can doubt whether human dignity is really a universal value. I think there's a speaker that spoke in the morning and said when conservation places are set aside and exclude people, is not all people. you need to capitalize the word people because, it doesn't mean what it means. It's a code word. And therefore, I think human dignity, when looked through the specs of conservation, has something else. It's not universal. It excludes indigenous peoples. You may agree or disagree, but let's proceed. Now, one of the earliest reports to talk about the problem of conservation and indigenous peoples was authored by the then Special Rapporteur, Victoria Tauli-Coppers. Most of you know Vicky, as she's fondly known as, and she presented a report to the UN General Assembly, which, as I said, is the highest body in the UN hierarchy. It comprises of heads of states and governments. So it's really such a privilege to bring the matters there. Someone would expect that the problem would be solved. But the report is big, but what Vicky says is that there's large-scale human rights violations relating to conservation. And she mentions some of those problems emanating from evictions as being marginalization. So indigenous peoples are highly marginalized. And she also talks about poverty. So indigenous peoples are highly impoverished. It's very traumatizing when you are evicted because you are uprooted from your land, and therefore poverty is a natural result. And there's loss of livelihoods. Indigenous peoples all over the world, and in Africa in particular, depends on their lands for their livelihoods. Talk about pastoralists, for example, they need the land for water, for grasslands, for salt lick. It comprises everything they need to make pastoralism possible. And therefore, if they are evicted, that livelihood is decimated, causing food insecurity. But Vicky talks also about extrajudicial killings. And I think this targets even more the defenders of those people that, the level of disappearance was alarming. And I was a member of the UN Permanent Forum when Vicky came and talked about how many environmental and indigenous people's defenders, die extrajudicially. But it also disrupts links to spiritual sites and, denies indigenous people's access to justice and remedies. Spiritual sites are located in the forests, sometimes in physical, natural resources. And when you deny indigenous people's access, it becomes very difficult for them to practice their cultural rights as well as their spirituality. Something else that is of interest for the region, for which I'm the campaign manager for IPLP Africa, is that Vicky talks about Botswana, Cameroon, Kenya, Namibia, South Africa, and the United Republic of Tanzania as being countries where most of the existing protected areas have been established on indigenous people's rights. So if you are in a protected area in one of those countries, just to know that you are enjoying a drink at a place where it was formerly a sacred site of the indigenous peoples, or it really formed the bedrock of their livelihoods. And just before José Francisco Calí, the current UN Special Rapporteur on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, presented his report, there was another report I'm happy to talk about by the UN Permanent Forum. I was a member by then, and it was presented in 2018. So I'm there in the middle. On my right is my colleague and friend, Brian Keane. We were commissioned by the UN Permanent Forum to conduct a study to examine conservation and indigenous people's rights. And on my left, most of you know him again, is Mordecai Ogada, a Kenyan activist who is very much known for his seminal book, The Biggest Conservation Lie. And what we did is we talked about rights, that indigenous peoples have rights to their lands, territories, and resources, and responsibilities of states, that they have the responsibility to protect those rights. And, you know, we needed some redress mechanism. But let me go quickly to the current UN Special Rapporteur, José Francisco Calí Tzay, who presented his report in July 2022. That was 19th of July, to be specific. And he talked about indigenous people's rights in conservation, and he laid a lot of emphasis in the state obligations under international law. And he says that the persistence and practice of forced evictions for conservation purposes is particularly worrying in Africa. Those are not my words. They are UN Special Rapporteur's words. In his findings, he concluded that the problem of forced evictions, you know, remember what Vicky said, what forceful eviction results, is particularly worrying in African region. And he talks about Tanzania as well as in Kenya. And I think most of you can have access to that report and see, you know, some details. But I'm much more interested in one of the recommendations advanced by Special Rapporteur José Francisco Calí. He's saying that he recommends application of a strict rights-based approach to the creation or expansion of existing protected areas. And that kept my mind, you know, clicking and saying, how can this happen in practice, especially in my region? So, based on the UN Special Rapporteur's recommendations, I went ahead and made a comprehensive review of protected areas legislation in 6 Eastern African and Southern African countries. And my intention was to see how those laws provide for reference to human dignity, either expressly or through implied connections. So I was not very strict in demanding that inclusion of human dignity. So anything that by necessary interpretation or implication may mean that it points to the respect for human dignity, we could check. And I studied, of course, with the aid of the IPLP clinic students and I'm very grateful. We looked at Botswana, Namibia, South Africa, Tanzania, Kenya, and Uganda for East Africa. And the criteria for the selection of those countries out of many is the linguistic criterion, meaning many of the laws of those countries are publicly available and they are in English. But apart from that, it's the fact that those countries I've selected have been on the spotlight, on the limelight internationally regarding implications or violations of allegations of violations of indigenous people's rights. And why did I choose human dignity as a reference or analytical framework? It's because it underscores its very generous or all-encompassing usage under international law to really prohibit discrimination of any type. So human dignity foregrounds equality and non-discrimination. And another is because this disproportional targeting of indigenous peoples in the conservation areas. And this implicates, as I said, the perceived universality of human dignity. What did we find? We found out that protected area laws are human dignity blind, whether expressly or by necessary implications or interpretations. All laws were found to have no reference to human dignity. Rather, the spirit of all laws reflect the country's colonial past, and therefore they replicate the Yosemite model of fortress conservation as evidenced by recurring evictions of stewards of those lands. So it's not by chance that people or stewards of those lands are evicted. It's because the problem, the DNA, as I said, is in the laws, is a reflection, is a relic of those countries' colonial past. And the author Esme Murdoch talks about model fortress conservation, the Yosemite, and it says that it promotes incredible violence, hardship, and harm to the landowners, not only through dispossession of land, but also interruption of indigenous lifeways that are tied to the lands themselves. And paradoxically, we know that indigenous peoples are the stewards of their lands, and therefore it makes more ecological sense to allow them to safeguard their lands than to evict them from it. That's the finding of our analysis of legislation on protected areas from 6 African countries. And then we went ahead and surveyed framework environmental legislation in the same countries, same methodology, whether they embody expressly or through interpretation, human dignity, and the same countries, same criteria of English availability of publicly available documents. But it was really interesting to see that framework environmental legislation, all of them, almost all of them, had some principle of environmental management, which are guiding principles or interpretive tools for those laws. And apart from putting them, in fact, they mandate everyone who has, the authority, who has power to implement the legislation, to be bound or to abide by those principles. And I like the South African law, Leslie's here. It says, just to paraphrase, that one of the environmental principles is to place people at the center and the forefront of its concerns, and to work on the people's physical, psychological, development, cultural, and social interest equitably. So unlike, unlike protected areas laws, framework environmental legislations are very much in line with what we are talking about, human dignity, because by necessary interpretation, all environmental principles are in one way or the other very key in advancing respect to human dignity. And as I conclude, our finding based on a thorough survey of the legislation in Africa is that the DNA of all those problems implicating lack of respect for dignity, the DNA is in the laws, which are a relic of colonialism. And therefore, we need to decolonize conservation by really getting rid of the spirit that promotes evictions and is blind of human dignity. And we need to do that by, if now to come very practical, we need to borrow a leaf from framework environmental legislation and include reference to human dignity. And not only include it, but in very strong words, saying that everyone exercising powers shall observe the principles or the principle of respect for human dignity. So let me finish by paraphrasing Martin Luther King, that I also have a dream that one day we will see African laws governing, establishing and managing protected areas with this provision enshrined in them, that everyone exercising power shall observe the principle of human dignity, which prohibits discrimination based on anything, and by extension, it is aligned with the International Day for the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and of course, the Day of Forest, because not only will it promote biodiversity, but it will also aid in the elimination of racial discrimination. I think I will stop there, and it's my privilege now to welcome the next speaker, who is Leslie Jensen, and then will be followed by Cape2. So if you can hear me, Leslie, please feel free to also introduce yourself a bit more, currently what you are doing. And we are very happy you accepted our invitation, and the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Eli. It is an absolute pleasure for me to be here. That is I regard it as my former hometown, and people very close to my heart is in Arizona. So yes, what I've prepared for tonight's discussion is basically looking at Southern Africa. I hope everybody can see my presentation. Can I just get a confirmation? Eli, you can see it?
Yes, I can see it.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks. So yes, I've prepared 3 examples from Southern Africa, where basically communities in the context of conservation, how they are dealing with the challenges, and what are the spectrum of racism and discrimination that they are facing. It's a lot of information that I've condensed. I've done something ambitious to do 3 examples in 20 minutes, but I will give it my best shot. So here goes. Firstly, just to start off with, the fact that I'm from the organization called JAMA International, who is supporting our work in Southern Africa as a UK charity, but they are essentially supporting people-centered conservation. And they've been doing this now since 2010, also covering areas of well-being, education, and different projects also globally. The first example that I would like to share is that of community-based natural resource management, which is been building the last 3 decades in Southern Africa. And it is basically involving rural communities in wildlife conservation to allow them to access benefits accruing from wildlife-based industries. The advent of it came after a post-colonial era, when African states were looking for different ways to conserve the environment from those imposed by colonial governments. And the colonial approach, as you said, Prof, is known as fortress conservation, whereby national parks were set up, people displaced, and those living in rural areas were prevented from using their resources in traditional ways, being labeled as poachers, and all of the wildlife, whether it occurred in parks or beyond, was generally considered a government property. However, mid-1900s, some of the rules against wildlife were relaxed, but only white-owned properties in South Africa, Namibia, and Zimbabwe. And this was mainly because governments realized wildlife outside of parks were being eradicated, and despite nominally protected as state property. So the changes to legislation marked the rise of game on private land, leading to increasing wildlife populations in these countries. So due to colonial and apartheid laws, Black people living in communal lands were not granted the same rights to use wildlife and were regularly punished as poachers. So CBNRM then comes in as a means of granting rights, similar rights to wildlife and other resources of plants and fish on communal land, as also existed on private land. So CBNRM for these rural communities, of which indigenous peoples are quite a central component, has become a major part of conservation in the Southern African countries. And it's different African states have started to build it in different ways. The income from CBNRM or community-based natural resources, it's varied, and it employs community guards, scouts, rangers. It basically supports conservation. It conducts anti-poaching patrols, reduces human-wildlife conflict. It educates members of the community on the importance of conservation. It supports staff. In some countries, the revenue generated is shared by governments, and they take a percentage from the concessions, and that varies from different countries. This income supports building, repairing kindergartens and clinics, providing electricity to villages, maintaining water infrastructure. It's brought education graduates, scholarships. It's really put people through different forms of schooling. It's supported funerals. Vulnerable members were given cash, such as pensioners. So as you said, Prof, it really is, indigenous people are really affected by this lifestyle that they've built, called community-based natural resource management. The problem comes in because Global North have decided that they are attempting conservation by proposing wildlife import restrictions. And these restrictions is reflected through different laws that they are proposing, which is directly going to impact the livelihoods of our indigenous communities, especially in Southern Africa. These laws, although it's developed in their own national context, it's directly going to impact our communities in Southern Africa. And I'm quite concerned because our indigenous communities in Southern Africa are up to 100% reliant on these incomes. And so they've been in a very strenuous process engaged to bring awareness to the Global North about the impacts of what they're doing, because this system of CBNRM is highly regulated. It's scientifically supported. Our numbers and our growth in biodiversity are supporting these efforts. And I've just shown the income, what it's actually, how it's supporting conservation and what it's contributing to these people's lives. If there are people from these different countries in the symposium, I really would like to call on your support to reach out to your respective countries and to let them know that this is being done without the free, prior, and informed consent of indigenous communities who've been using CBNRM to pick up the pieces of their lives. And we really need the Global North not to undermine and take away from what these already vulnerable communities are building. So that would be my first example. My second example impacting this conversation of today would basically be along the fact that a lot of our communities in Southern Africa are hunter-gatherers. And I think their challenge has been taken up quite aptly in the African Commission's regional report, 2003 report around indigenous people, which affirmed that people in Africa self-identifying as indigenous are in fact part of the global movement, are indigenous, and I think important legislation have emerged out of that since then. Why that is important and how it relates to hunter-gatherer communities is that 19 states that the report looked at states that systematically communities were found not to access in post-colonial Africa their rights on par with other dominant cultural communities. And when they took a deeper look at those communities in those 19 states, it found that they were historical and current hunter-gatherer and nomadic pastoralist communities. So in post-colonial constitutional dispensations, African indigenous communities with these ways of lives, their aspirations and their development priorities and approaches were not included in the construction of post-colonial constitutional dispensations. Development was considered and measured against whether they are sedentary, using land so-called productively, and takes a very, agriculturalist approach. Some communities, especially in Southern Africa, have been bearing the brunt of this mismatched development approaches, and it has resulted in land dispossessions, deep cultural disruptions, extreme malnutrition, no access to basic food and medicinal sources. This is no more apt than in the example of this hunter-gatherer community in Namibia, which is the Kwe or the San community, who basically lives on this strip of land. You will see the strip, it's sort of that part that protrudes outside of Namibia, and they live in a national park, and it's been a national park since 2007. It was previously, during the apartheid era, a military base, and these communities as hunter-gatherers live in this 100-kilometer wide or in length area, which both sides, they're both neighbors on both sides of the rivers, are in fact cattle farmers, politically very strong, dominant cultural communities. And these communities face serious encroachment on their lives and their land, and not just for the Kwe community in Babatwa National Park, but also in other protected areas in Namibia, is seen as vacant land. It's seen as grazing land for these communities whose land are often overgrazed. And so the indigenous communities in Southern Africa are particularly vulnerable because our development approaches, particularly when it comes to conservation, and I like what Prof. Eli said around dignity, because this is definitely, amongst others, a dignity issue, because their way of life, their existence is not considered when these conservation initiatives, land use planning, developments are set up. It doesn't take their way of life at all in consideration. And this is on top of the fact that they are struggling for recognition, that they are struggling with their recognition of their languages, their culture, access to the food, medicinal sources. So this community has also taken up a process of developing a biocultural community protocol, because of the fact that to fill that gap in the law, in a sense, and to use the biocultural community protocol to articulate their aspirations and challenges as a hunter-gatherer community. So the issue of hunter-gathering as a land use, definitely in the context of conservation, has definitely undermined their human dignity quite seriously. And then I thirdly would like to go to a South African example, and I know I'm running quite fast through these examples, but I'm just mindful of the time. I think the conversation of racism and conservation would not be apt if I don't refer to one of our South African examples. And this is the example I would like to use, is quite a special mountain for us. This is a Table Mountain in Cape Town. Most people that have been tourists in Cape Town would have taken the cable car up to Table Mountain. You can see up there is the area that you would generally take the Table Mountain, and it's a beautiful tourist experience for people visiting our country. and our town, and it's something we definitely want to encourage because it does give important revenue. But the story that's not told about this mountain is that it's a mountain range of about 25 kilometers, and it holds a lot of cultural property for our indigenous people. It's called the Hurikwaha, Mountain in the Sea, by indigenous people. And in order to understand how the challenges around this mountain as a protected area, I think it's important that I just give a little bit of a backdrop to some, or let me say it situates within the South African story. South Africa survived an over 300-year history of colonialism, apartheid, different successive colonial states. And the dispossession that has occurred in South Africa is I think we're still reeling from it in many ways. And unfortunately, a key component of apartheid and what we survived was the extreme apartheid spatial planning, where a lot of people were moved, and the infrastructure largely reflected the rich and the poor, and continue to reflect the rich and the poor quite strongly in South Africa today. The picture we have down here is basically a modern day reflection of an example of our remnant of apartheid spatial planning that has not changed. And so the Table Mountain that you see as which is a natural, it's a heritage site. It holds water sources, it holds unique mammals, unique, it's part of our floral kingdom. As I said, it hosts very important cultural property. You'll see the picture in the middle is a little cave, but we call it Elephant's Eye because this is the elephant's head, and the back part is its body. And that cave is not just a cave for us, because that used to be a castle that our Khoisan princess or Khoi princess used to live in historically. And Table Mountain as an area, our people don't have, unless they go in as tourists, it's very hard for them to have proper access, use, and management of our cultural property. This mountain range, it's, as I said, historically, it was 16 magisterial districts where the indigenous people used to live along this mountain range, and they were forcibly removed from those areas, and they were then shifted to what is the Cape Flats today. And the Cape Flats is basically a wetland where all of these the infrastructure that has been set up is just way below human dignity, as Prof. Eli outlined. And what we're trying to do now is to, similar to the Namibia example I gave, we are also trying to support the indigenous communities in Cape Town to organize themselves in a biocultural community protocol to ensure that they can negotiate access, use, and management rights to be able to steward their cultural property on Table Mountain. And so this is it's a massive process, but it's doable. It's been done before. And the idea would be that although South Africa's laws in principle does, as you said, Prof, it does try to put the people at the center. It does try to give them that focus, but the implementation are totally misguided. So we are trying to shift the strategy towards indigenous lawmaking, putting the power back into the people's hands, where they, even though the laws might not articulate their aspirations and priorities, we are trying to use these protocols that they design themselves, merge it with the laws, affirming, the parts of our laws that do speak to their rights, and affirming their own knowledge and customary practices, and to use that now to negotiate for the biocultural property and biocultural rights on the mountain. So it's going to be very interesting to see how the process unfolds going forward. But we are very, very excited for this process to continue. So that's really in short some of the examples that I wanted to share. Thank you, Prof. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Leslie. That is a very powerful presentation. Colleagues and friends, Leslie didn't mention, but I must mention that in the region, in Africa, she's very much known for her very big contribution in the concept of biocultural protocols, of course, with the lawyers, natural justice, the NGO based in South Africa. But she also served as a member of the working group that works under the African Commission on indigenous populations. And this is really a very key institution for Africa, because it's the one that charts out and conceptualized applicability of the indigenous platform in the continent. Now I have a very singular privilege and pleasure to welcome our second speaker, Kipto Barasa, who is doing his doctorate now in the University of Arizona, the IPLP. And Kipto, you have the floor. Please feel free to introduce yourself a little bit more, the community you belong to, and the amazing research you have been doing on the ground. Over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kipto, as you've heard, Barasa. I come from Kenya and I belong to the Indigenous people. We live around Lake Bogoria. And I have also worked with the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights, and the things that we have spoken here, I've seen them firsthand. I have been in this field for some time, and coming to the University of Arizona to study Indigenous Peoples Law and Policy has opened my eyes more to appreciate that the things that is not only happening in Kenya, but also globally. So my presentation will give a perspective of Kenya on the issue of racism and the conservation aspect, which we call protected areas. It's actually a con. They are conning us. They are conning indigenous peoples, and you've seen and you will continue to see that it is a con business. They are conning indigenous people. So we will see how they established this fortress conservation, that all of them happened without FP, that is the free, prior, and informed consent. No indigenous peoples were consulted, neither were we compensated. We have also the role of financiers and donors, just like my professor Rob showed, including those boards serving in WWF. You've seen that they play a big role in oiling the violations that are taking place and are happening against indigenous peoples. The ecotourism that is taking place, they are telling us it is indigenous, it is protected areas. They want it pristine, they want it to be a wilderness, but you will see that there are eco lodges that are found inside these protected areas, and forced evictions are taking place, which is an aspect of human rights violations. And our governments in Africa are also doing mega projects within these protected areas. It's crazy, and that is the irony of it. To indigenous people, they will tell us, we're taking away your land because we want to create a protected area. But once we are out of those protected areas, they come in and do mega infrastructure projects inside those protected areas. So when they established the fortress conservations, they said our lands were wasteland. We didn't know how to use these lands. And so they said, actually, the British, when they came to encourage farmers from Britain to come to Kenya, they said, we have found a tabula rasa. They wrote in those words that it's an empty space. Come and do the farming, come and do the come and do the work here. They termed our lands as wasteland because they thought we didn't know how to use them. And therefore they started taking away the land, declaring it as a colony. And once we still got independence, we thought we would get back the lands, but indigenous peoples are still on the losing end, because they say the lands where indigenous peoples, like where I come from, the land is dry. And in some places they say it's a forest. So we have to create a protected area out of it. The decisions that were made to create the conservancies, they said those decisions will only be made with the county councils. That is the Kenyan situation. So land was managed. Land in Kenya is divided into 3 categories. We have government lands, which is public land. We have private lands, that is one that has title deeds, it has been subdivided, and then we have community lands. And in the community lands, they say decisions on community lands will be made by the county councils. They will not come to the indigenous people. They will go to the governor. They will go to someone sitting, and who basically may not even be an indigenous person. So they will go to one individual called a governor. They make a decision to say we want to create a conservancy, and that will be done without involving indigenous peoples. That happened with creation of Mount Elgon National Park, and also a forest, and they took away land from the Ogiek people. They went to Mau Forest Complex, they did the same, they took away land, and that is how the Ogieks lost land. They went to Lake Bogoria, that is how my people lost land. Actually, my grandfather lost land in 1973 from Lake Bogoria. Among about 73 elders who were documented at the time of the case, my grandfather was in the list. And guess what they were paid? They were paid 300 Kenya shillings. 300 Kenya shillings translates to less than $2. And they said that was disturbance money. And they told them, go to a town called Kabaranet. For you to access the money, you have to go and open an account so that you can get your money. My grandfather is not learning. For them to get to that town, that was a colonial administrative town with a bank. It was difficult. They didn't get the $2 that they ought to have gotten. They said the chief will go and talk to the DC because the money was not being withdrawn. So they said that a chief will go and withdraw the money through the DC. The DC will withdraw, give it to the chief, for the chief to go and look for those elders to give them the money. And I don't think whether they got the money. So the Embabut, they created Embabut, and that is how the Sengwer lost land. They created Ells Gate National Reserve, and that's how the Maasais lost their land. They created Boni Dodori Forest, and that is how the Aware lost. They created Laikipia National Reserve, and that is how the Samburus lost their land. Here I heard of Mikosuki, and I got a chance to study of the tribulations and the things that they're going through at Everglades. And everywhere you look in Kenya, east to west, everywhere where indigenous peoples are, they have lost their land. At least here you can just talk of Mikosuki, and I really want justice to be done to those peoples. But in Kenya, it's all indigenous peoples have lost land somewhere. The financiers and the donors are really channeling money through the government of Kenya. And the government of Kenya will use the money to fund 2 agencies, security agencies. We have the Kenya Forest Service and the Kenya Wildlife Service. They use that money to buy motor vehicles and ammunition to chase away, to continue evicting lands belonging to indigenous peoples. So we have donor agencies present and also conservation agencies present in protected areas. As you can see in that map, that gentleman in a t-shirt is it has a logo, the panda logo for the WWF, and beside him is a ranger, and they are just like doing things. That is Mau Forest. This happened in the Mau Forest, and they said that they are doing participatory forest management something to bring in the community. But last year, I was sent by the commission to go and investigate evictions that happened to the Ogiek people. Right now, Ogiek people cannot go back to their lands. Yet they won a case at the African Court of Human Rights, of Peoples and Human Rights. So there's a lot of impunity. People are still outside their lands. Donors are there and they're not doing anything to tell the government, stop this or we will not give you the money, and violations are taking place. In 2018, we did a big report when European Union wanted to give the government of Kenya that 31 million euros. And when they said, the Sengwer complained, they were doing a water project, something called water project, that is, it's connected to Red Plus. They shot people and burnt houses. And European Union could not believe it, that Kenya government could still do this. So they said the only institution that can give us the true picture of what's happening in the community is the Kenya National Commission on Human Rights. I went and I saw it firsthand that they shot someone. They burnt 28 houses belonging to the Sengwer people. And what they said is, those are not houses. They said, we found structures that looked like houses. To them, a house has to be brick and mortar, but to indigenous peoples of the Sengwer, they live wherever they will. They know how they will live in the forest, even if they construct what they will. That is their house. It's not you to define what a house is. Fortunately, through that report, the money was suspended and the government of Kenya didn't get the 31 million euros that they wanted to. Look at that picture.
Yeah. Maybe you wanna, yeah, yeah, here.
So that is the picture I talked about.
Yeah. So
I'll be using this, sorry about that. So the gentleman in the middle is putting on a t-shirt that has the logo of WWF, and rangers are there. There are no indigenous peoples over there. And this is happening in Mau Forest. So the WWF is actually complicit of the violations that are targeted on indigenous peoples. This is a Maasai who is grazing his cattle in Nairobi. They took away their land and created Nairobi National Park. That is the land belonging to Maasais. And so Maasais now will graze cattle by the roadside. This is so close to the central business district of Nairobi. It's called Lang'ata Road. And therefore, in times of drought, the Maasais have nowhere to graze their cattle. Right near the city is Nairobi National Park. It is so huge, it has a lot of grass, but the Maasais cannot graze. They will have to graze by the roadside. And around that time, New York Times reported that as grass dwindle in Kenya, as grass dwindle, Kenya's shepherds seek urban pastures. So the story is Maasais are seeking pastures on the roadsides. It is capturing the attention of the whole world. Yet right across is a huge park that they have created and took away Maasai land, and they can't access it. All those cattle may die in the drought, yet their cattle will be just grazing along the roads, risking causing traffic and many other things that can happen along the way. Around the same time, Los Angeles Times reported that Maasai cattle finds grass in Nairobi urban gardens. So nobody will say that they took away the land of Maasais. They will report other things. It's very interesting to see a Maasai in the town grazing cattle, but right just across is a huge land that has a lot of grass, but Maasais cannot be allowed to graze cattle inside there. They have hotels inside, no access. And they say, which is actually the notion that was brought by the colonial government, is that the cattle that Maasais own do not have economic value. It's not an enterprise that anybody can be interested in. Around last year, when they were forcibly removing Ogiek people from the Mau Forest, contrary to a court case and a judgment for that matter, an officer from Kenya Water Towers Agency, that is the chairman. He wrote, this is a tweet that he posted, that today the chairman, Honorable Rashid Echesa, that is Water Towers, is the agency that he works in, reported like this. Today, the chairman, Honorable Rashid Echesa, inspected progress made on the ongoing recovery of some sections of Masai Mau Water Tower. He noted that the security team led by Rift Valley Regional Commissioner, Mr. Abdi Hassan, has removed illegal forest dwellers in the following areas: Enengatia, Oloropo, Ololoriki, Naitupaki, Olokurto, and Medungi. The areas to be handled in the next 14 days will be Sasumwani, Kilaba, and Nkereta. This is part of the full recovery of the forest land that had been illegally converted into settlement areas. The first phase, which included areas of Kosia and Kasefem, was done in 2018, followed by phase 2 in 2019, which covered Sierra Leone, Chebitet, and adjacent sections. Honorable Soipan Tuya, that is the Cabinet Secretary for Environment, Climate Change, and Forestry, said something that the evictions will continue, but in a humane manner. At least no life should be lost. So they are calling the Maasai people illegal forest dwellers. They are saying that all these names that they're mentioning here, these are Maasai names. All this, it's their home. They want to recover, I don't know, in the next other 14 days, other places, which they previously did in 2018, 2019, and people died. And so they're so proud and reporting here. And the minister said, no life should be lost. Do other things, do what you can do to those people, at least don't kill them. So they are really endorsing forced evictions, violence, arson, all manner of violations that you can do. And she can just say, at least don't kill. But yes, you can do other things to those people, chase them away. And this is their lands, and it's contrary to a court judgment. I mean, there's no other impunity that anybody can display openly for the whole world to see in a land that belongs to those people. And let's see what will happen next. In the next slide, you will see for yourself that this is what they did in Sasumwani area. I went to this place. That is an Ogiek man. That is his house. They have destroyed a store, a house. Everything is vandalized. And you even see some of those poles are soothed. They were burnt. Part of it were burnt. So all these people were evicted. Children were about to do national examinations, and it was on a El Nino system. There was a lot of rains in Kenya that time, and all this happened. And these people cannot go back to their lands, even as we speak right now. So the mega infrastructural projects that are taking place in Kenya right now, if you go to Mau Forest, they are doing a dam that is going to excise about 700 acres of forest land. And this actually will affect the water that drains to the Mara, that Masai Mara. So to indigenous peoples, they will tell you, get out of the forest because it's a protected area. We want it to remain pristine. But when it comes to, they want to get water, they will go and excise the forest as they want. This is about 700 acres that will go away. It's still Ogiek land, in my view. They are not consulted. They can do all that they want to do with it. They will tell you as an indigenous person, it's a protected area, you are not needed here. We want the forest to remain intact. But when they go back to their offices, they do other things to affect the same forest. This happened in Lamu, that is the coastal part of Kenya. They want to do Lamu Port, South Sudan, Ethiopia Transport Corridor as part of Kenya Vision 2030 strategy, aimed at transforming Kenya into a middle-income economy, And they chased away the aware people from their land, and this is what they are doing. They want to do a airport. They want to do 13 berths. That is where they can anchor the ships. And this is going to serve not only one country. This is going to serve South Sudan, Ethiopia, and I think partly Uganda. So what we're saying is to indigenous peoples, they will tell you it's a conservancy. We have a reason to remove you. But then for them, they can do other things which they want to do with the lands, for as long as you are not inside those lands. So it's not only lands that were taken during colonial period, because all the time, if you come to my country, people will blame that, you know, all these things that we're facing is because of the colonial era. But even by ourselves, we still discriminate against indigenous peoples. We still feel like there are other people who cannot have equal rights like every other Kenyan. Like now we are blacks, but we can still do other, you know, these things against ourselves. So I'm going to stop there, and but indigenous peoples will continue the struggle until the kingdom comes. We are not going to lose. We are not going to let go just like that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kipto. That is a very powerful presentation based on you know, experience on the ground and very much aligned to the reality now. So I listened to two of you, and what comes in my mind, I think the common denominator of your two presentations is the fact that land dispossession happens because of the concept of unused land, which has colonial origin, the concept of terra nullius. And I think I won't talk much more, but it reminds me of a quotation from Chinua Achebe, I think one of the consequential writers of the 20th century, a very important and famous you know, Nigerian novelist. So he wrote many books, including Things Fall Apart, which is famous, known to most of you. But he wrote another book called Home and Abroad. I think something like that. And this is what he says. I'll read that as a summary of the reaction to your presentations, and then I'll open up for question and answers from the audience. So Achebe says, and I quote, "Let us imagine that someone has come along to take my land from me. We would not expect him to say he is doing it because of his greed or because he is stronger than I. Such a confession would brand him as a bully. So he hires a storyteller with a lot of imagination to make up a more appropriate story, which must say, for example, that the land in question could not be mine because I had shown no aptitude to cultivate it properly for maximum productivity and profitability. It might go on to say that the reason for my inefficiency is my very low IQ, and I explain that explain that my brain had stopped growing at the age of 10. So there are a lot of stories justifying dispossession, and this is common as reminded to us by Achebe. So with those few remarks, it's my pleasure now to welcome reactions, questions, additions from the audience. And I think my colleagues Vishal and Gabi, you can read questions if we have any from the audience.
Yes. Michelle, have any questions been sent in on chat, and questions from the audience? Any questions for any of our panelists, general or specifically directed?
Back to you, Professor Williams.
Okay. So yes,
And the audience, they are present, can also ask.
all right. Any questions? Yes,
This mic
Mike.
with you.
Mike Wilson, I'll repeat your question so that everyone else can hear it, and then Vishal or Kiptu can answer.
Yeah. Mike Wilson is my name. I'm Tono Autumn from Southern Arizona. I agree with the professor's comment that dignity is inherent in all people, but I would just like to continue that conversation in honor of the forest. Dignity also applies to the forest. Every tree in Native American cultures has a spirit. Therefore, the forest is a community of spirits, equally deserving of dignity. Because when you separate the land and the trees and the water from the human part, you minimize the dignity of all creation. And so I just want to say that, that it's another mindset. It's an indigenous mindset, indigenous people's mindset, that a forest is not there for the extractive industry. The forest is there for us to live together, inseparate, that we are of the forest. The forest is our mother, the desert is our mother. All creation, we are related equally. So I just wanted to add that to the conversation. This is who we are, inseparable.
Thank you. And Ellie and Kiptu, were you able to hear any of that? I can summarize it quickly and then get your reactions. I actually have a follow-up on that.
Yes,
Are
we
you
could
there?
hear. Kiptu,
Yeah.
you can go ahead.
Yeah, Mike's question was about the significance of forest landscapes to indigenous peoples, but particularly the forest. And I know that's true in North America and throughout Latin America, but maybe if you or Kiptu or both of you, because you both come from indigenous communities that are closely connected and survive on the land and recognize the land as sacred, could you talk a little bit about the perspective of your own group and your own community with respect to the forest and to the lands? You know, what is sort of the native knowledge, the traditions of stewardship, and maybe address that a bit to give some context to the discussion.
Yes, thank you very much. I totally agree with the speaker. It's the same way among indigenous peoples in Africa. Land has enormous spiritual significance, and in the same sense of holistic conception. So among pastoralists, for example, the land is replete with the sacred trees that are important for ceremonies. If women, for example, want to bless young women, they use oreteti, which is a Maasai sacred tree. And so, as he's saying, you cannot really separate indigenous peoples from their lands, including both trees and other natural features, because of the enormous spiritual and cultural significance they have. So, and it's the same also for hunter-gatherers, and for the Maasai particularly that I know of. That's why when some trees are endangered, they are in danger of disappearance or extinction, we were told that some tree species are God's plant. So in the Maasai, in Ngorongoro, we had, Alchanilangai, which means God's trees, and because they are enormously important. So it's the same. I think that is, it speaks, it rings true even for our people that, land is part and parcel of indigenous people's existence, both as a matter of livelihood, spirituality, as well as their cultural rights.
Do you have anything to add to that or provide a perspective from your own community?
Yes.
Oh, there it is. Come on up.
Yeah, to support what Dr. Eli just said, and from what the elder who spoke, is that trees are so important to us. Even for the honey that is gotten from the forest, the hives that they make, our people know how to make the beehive. They will go for some branches and leave the tree to grow. Same to the herbs. They even do not remove from the bark. They will know how to go to the roots, get to extract like a few, twigs without killing the tree. So our people don't kill trees. Trees are so important. They're so sacred. Same to wild animals. We have every family as a totem. So an animal will be attributed to a given family. Hyena, there are families who identify with the hyena. They will say our animal is the hyena. Others will identify with a given bird. Mine is a sun. My totem is the sun. My elders didn't go for the animals, but they went to the sun. So that is how we are so connected to nature, trees, animals, and everything. So nobody can teach us conservation because we really understand how to do it. Even if a hyena could kill a cow of another person, and there are people who are planning to go and kill the hyena, to look for the hyena and kill, a person from that family can say, because it's our totem, we can contribute and pay another cow as a compensation so that you don't have to kill the animal. And that is how we are so connected, and we love nature, and it's part of us. Thank you.
Thank you.